Dear listeners, we would love to get to know you better. Please write in the comments which country and city you are watching us from. Thank you. Oscar Vincent spent most of his time in prison, either in solitary confinement or in the infirmary. Those convicted of serious crimes often struggle to make it out alive, and Oscar's limited martial arts skills were no match for the numbers and street fighting abilities of his attackers. Somehow, he managed to defend himself well enough to survive beatings, stabbings, and various assaults. He had become a temporary target for more people than he wanted to remember. Everything had been drained from his life except for one thing: the need for revenge. He was innocent, and after 7 years, 3 months, and 2 days, he was finally released. But who's counting? He had survived 1 day at a time, though each day felt like a year. Each morning he woke up in prison. He wondered if it would be his last, and each night brought him just a little closer to the day he could finally seek justice. When Oscar left prison, he was glad no one waited for him outside the gate. If someone had, it probably would have been with deadly intent. He knew his former family would have to be notified to protect his estranged daughter. On one level, Oscar understood that Carol had likely been coerced into testifying against him. But on another, she remained a major reason for the devastation that had stolen his life. And it wasn't just her. Brian Hall was the true source of his misery. His former best friend had seduced his way into Oscar's family, using money and charm, and spreading lies about what he had supposedly seen. Brian even influenced some of Oscar's students to make false accusations. That Brian married Oscar's wife Jane as soon as the divorce was finalized only confirmed his motives. Jane, his wife of 15 years, had refused to believe Oscar's protests of innocence. She sat beside his accuser throughout the trial. Their years together hadn't earned him enough trust for her to stand by him. And now that Oscar had been released, he worried for his life, even more outside than within prison. He had made it clear, loudly in court, that he was a threat to Brian, and Oscar had no doubts Brian was capable of harm. His need to disappear was pressing. He couldn't afford to stay where Brian might find him. Despite everything, life seemed to give him an ironic reprieve. A bureaucratic mistake meant that Oscar's former family wasn't notified of his release until 3 days later. When Brian found out, he was furious. Oscar realized, too, that the harsh treatment he had received from inmates had an unexpected benefit. The scars on his face were hidden by a beard and long hair, which greatly altered his appearance. During his prison kitchen duties, a cruel incident had left his hands scared and devoid of fingerprints. Now authorities would struggle to identify him easily. Oscar's first stop was a Goodwill store, where he bought clothes suitable for the changing weather and his new destination: homeless shelters. Next, he focused on blending into the homeless population. Fortunately for him, his community was in the midst of a benevolent competition among churches and charities, all trying to outdo one another in helping the homeless. Food was not an immediate concern. There were plenty of options for free meals. Oscar soon learned which agencies served the best meals on which days. Shelter was the biggest challenge. The Salvation Army and other locations had time limits on how long one could stay. Oscar's time in the Army gave him skills to create basic shelter in a wooded area within a city park. He found a large azalea bush open in the middle, and by weaving plastic bags among the branches, was able to create a decent barrier against cold and rain. Good, though not perfect. He became the target of several attempted muggings, but his knowledge of army and prison fighting techniques earned him a "don't mess with him" reputation among local gangs. One night, after hearing a struggle outside his shelter, Oscar debated whether to intervene or ignore it. When the sounds continued, he went out to either stop the fight or quiet things down. Under the bridge, he found several men trying to overpower a giant of a man who, despite the numbers, was holding his ground. "Please stop. I don't want to hurt you," the man kept repeating. When they didn't back down, Oscar called out, "It's okay to defend yourself. They're trying to harm you." The big man looked at Oscar and nodded, then swiftly neutralized his attackers with powerful, controlled strikes until those who could still move fled. When the scuffle ended, the large man asked, "I did the right thing, didn't I? I don't want to get sent away again." Oscar quickly realized his new friend was mentally challenged but incredibly strong. "Yes, you did the right thing. I'm Carlos Mendoza," Oscar said, using a new name he'd adopted to stay hidden. "What's your name?" "Harvey," the man replied. "You're not calling the police, are you?" "No, Harvey," Oscar assured him. "But we should leave, just in case someone else does." Then he noticed blood on Harvey's jacket. "Harvey, you're hurt. We need to get that looked at." "No hospital," Harvey said, visibly distressed. "I don't want a shot." Thinking fast, Oscar offered, "Would you go if I went with you?" "You'd stay with me?" Harvey asked. "Of course," Oscar said. He wrapped his scarf around Harvey's wound, and together they walked to the emergency room. The hospital staff, accustomed to incidents like this, quickly admitted Harvey, and Oscar stayed by his side. The two soon became close friends. In time, Oscar learned that Harvey Silverman had spent most of his life in an institution, but was released under deinstitutionalization reforms. Without a family to support him, Harvey was left to fend for himself. Oscar became both his friend and guide. Oscar and Harvey soon became an effective team. Oscar provided the planning and reasoning, while Harvey supplied the strength. Their relationship reminded Oscar of the characters from Of Mice and Men, with hopes for a far better ending. They scraped by on charitable resources and under-the-table jobs, which Harvey's physical abilities often made easier to secure. Harvey wouldn't accept work unless Oscar was included, and though their cognitive levels differed, Oscar enjoyed their conversations, finding Harvey's perspective refreshing. Oscar's past, meanwhile, weighed heavily on him. He viewed it as a simple sequence. Betrayal led to punishment, and now all that remained was justice. During his divorce, Oscar had received a settlement of $50,000. Despite the heartache his daughter's actions caused, he tried to send her the money for college, though his ex-wife returned it, refusing to accept anything from him. With prison ahead and dark labels attached to him, Oscar figured he wouldn't survive long once inside. As a last-ditch effort, he hired a private investigator, Ben Woods, to uncover any proof that Brian had orchestrated his ruin and to provide it to the authorities. Ben was initially hesitant to take on such an open-ended case but agreed, especially after receiving $50,000 up front. The last time Oscar had heard from Ben, the investigator had uncovered a promising lead he was actively following. But in the months that followed, Oscar received no further updates. Shortly after being released from prison, Oscar called Ben's office, only to learn that Ben had died a few months earlier. They couldn't find an active file on Oscar in their records. Any inactive cases had been archived, and to retrieve the file, Oscar would need to show up in person with ID, assuming his account was in good standing. When Oscar inquired further, he was told Ben had been killed in a mugging. Oscar felt a deep sense of dread, suspecting that Brian might have discovered Ben's investigation and silenced him. Determined to secure the file, Oscar hoped it hadn't already been destroyed. On Italian night at the Salvation Army, the next chapter of Oscar's life began to unfold. A Methodist church in town prepared a meal of spaghetti with meat sauce, salad, garlic bread, and homemade ice cream, a treat Oscar and Harvey looked forward to. While they ate, a young couple moved from table to table, speaking briefly with each person. At first, Oscar didn't recognize the woman, but a second glance revealed it was Carol, his estranged daughter, now an adult. He hoped his appearance had changed enough to avoid being recognized. When the couple approached Oscar and Harvey, Carol checked a paper with an old photo of Oscar and asked, "Are you Oscar Vincent?" Avoiding eye contact, Oscar kept eating. She repeated the question, and Harvey, confused by Oscar's silence, replied, "No, this is my friend Carlos." Frustrated, Carol turned to the young man beside her. "Joe, I don't think we're going to find him in time," she said, starting to cry. "Come on, sweetheart," Joe replied. "That man probably wouldn't help you even if you did find him. They walked away, leaving Oscar puzzled. What did she mean? Find him in time. He tried to dismiss it, though it nagged at him that his daughter might need him after all these years. This encounter made Oscar realize he had to act before any other surprises came his way. He decided to take the risk and go to Ben's office, hoping to recover any remaining evidence. Meanwhile, the local mayor was preparing for an upcoming Chamber of Commerce convention and wanted the city cleaned up. This meant making the visible homeless population disappear. Police, who Oscar suspected had a reputation for rough treatment, were assigned to the area near Oscar and Harvey's shelters. Oscar might have escaped their notice, but when Harvey was tasered multiple times, he couldn't abandon his friend. To protect Harvey, he stayed and endured the officers' treatment, including one tasering himself. This wasn't Oscar's first arrest in a homeless sweep. His lack of fingerprints and his assumed identity, Carlos Mendoza, had saved him before. He had exchanged most of his identification documents with an undocumented immigrant, and his Spanish skills were strong enough to maintain the disguise. Prison had been a place where he refined his high school Spanish with the slang and phrases needed for his new persona. He convinced the jailer to place him in a cell with Harvey, and his friend quickly calmed down once they were together. Then came another unexpected twist. Oscar's ex-wife, Jen, arrived at the jail. "I understand you've picked up a number of homeless men tonight," she told the officer. "I'm looking for my ex-husband. It's a matter of life and death." After describing Oscar and providing an old photo, the officer informed her that while many of the men matched her description, they all had fingerprints on file. However, one man without fingerprints did match and had a giant friend he kept calm. Jean asked to see him. The officer took Oscar to an interrogation room, cuffed him to a ring on the table, and left him to wait. Oscar sensed someone watching him through the two-way mirror, fearing it might be Carol. When Jean walked in, he was struck by how well she still looked, though his expression remained stony. She broke the silence. "Hello, Oscar, or should I say Carlos? I'll get to the point. I never thought I'd come to you for a favor, but here I am." "Oh, not a single glad to see you, dear, or sorry for helping ruin your life." Oscar shot back. "Figures." Ignoring his bitterness, Jean continued, "I don't care what insults you throw my way, but I'm hoping that somewhere you have a shred of compassion left for your daughter." Oscar interrupted. "I'm sticking with what I said before. Forget it, and forget my lying daughter." Jean kept calm. "I'm not here to retry your case. You were found guilty and got what was coming. All she did was tell the truth." "Truth?" Oscar sneered. "You mean that pack of lies you and your new husband drilled into her head? Did you coach her before she testified? Did you tell her exactly what to say?" "We told her to tell the truth. We might have advised her on how to handle questioning, that's all," Jean replied. "Sure, you did." Oscar pressed on before Jean could continue. "If I got what I deserved, you mean it's fine for an innocent man to be attacked, stabbed, beaten, and humiliated? Then yes, I guess I got exactly what I deserved. You should be Attorney General somewhere else because that's not justice." "What?" "I was told you were kept in isolation," Jean said, incredulous. "They knew the risks for someone convicted on charges like yours, and you don't look so bad off." Oscar scoffed. "Who told you that?" "Let me guess. Brian." Her face said he was right. He lifted his shirt to reveal scars and cigarette burns. "Guess this doesn't look so bad now, does it? Your loving husband would probably say I carved these myself to win sympathy. And these hands," he held up his hands, marked from injuries. "This is what happens when people decide you're a target in prison. Nearly 8 years ago, you were a fool to believe Brian over me. Tell me, did he set me up alone, or were you in on it?" Jean was visibly shaken, the pain on her face showing how hard it was to confront what her former husband had endured. But she forced herself to focus. She was here on a mission. Lying about Brian doesn't help. It's done. And I'm here to talk about Carol. "Forget it. I told you I want nothing to do with you, her, or Brian. Guard, take me back to my cell. She's dying, Jean said quietly. Oscar paused, then sneered. I thought I'd heard it all from you at my trial. But this really takes the cake. Carol lied about me, knowing what it could lead to. Why should I care if she's sick? After seeing the pain in Jen's eyes, Oscar sighed. What could you possibly want from me now? Isn't there any more damage you can do? A tearful Jean answered, I'm not lying, Oscar. Carol has kidney cancer. Both kidneys. She needs a transplant immediately. And we haven't been able to find a compatible donor. I'm just asking if you get tested to see if you're a match. If you ever loved her, please consider this. We'll pay you all we can. You think I care about money? Oscar replied bitterly. Fine. Here's my price. Reverse my conviction. Erase my scars. Undo what was done to me in prison. That's the payment I want. And as for loving my daughter, I loved her more than I loved you. And she threw that love away the moment she lied to the jury. So no, I'm not helping. Jean tried to reason with him. Think about this. If you're a match, we can talk about something reasonable, a reward, help reintegrating you back into society. She's your only daughter. Please, I'm begging you. Oscar considered this. Fine, I'll do the test. But if I'm not a match, you'll leave me alone. And you'll see that the police investigate my death if Brian has me killed. Brian's not trying to hurt you. Promise me, or forget it. Okay, I promise. The next day, a blood sample was taken, and the results expedited. Oscar was a match. Jean returned to the jail to see him. You're a match, she said. The transplant has to happen right away. We can do it tonight, assuming the DA agrees to release you temporarily. Oscar replied coolly, Is Brian in the next room? Jean looked sheepish. No. You're lying. Even after all these years, I can still read your face. Get rid of him, or there's no deal. He doesn't get to stay anywhere near this. Fine, I'll tell him to leave, Jean replied. No, give me your cell phone. Have the guard give his phone to Harvey in my cell. Dial your phone from his and put it on speaker for Harvey. If Brian leaves Harvey's sight, I'll know. After some protest from Brian, it was done as Oscar instructed. Now confident, Oscar turned to Jen. All right, here's my condition. I'll give Carol my kidney, but you cannot tell anyone, not even Brian, that I was the donor. Do you promise? Jean nodded. I promise. I also need you to go to Ben Wood's office. Here's the address. I hired him to investigate Brian to see if he set me up. I suspect Ben was killed for getting close to the truth, and I need you to find out what he uncovered. His cases were archived, so you'll need to ask for my file. That's it. What if they can't find it or won't give it to me? Find a way to get it, if it still exists. Okay, we'll try. Jen, I know that tone. You'll try. Unless something minor gets in your way. I want you to pledge on your daughter's life to search for it with the same determination you felt when you mistakenly believed that someone had told you I'd done something horrible to our daughter. I need you to show the same commitment to proving I'm innocent. That's the promise I require, or say goodbye to your daughter. And remember, if you say anything to Brian, I'm a dead man. Jean agreed. The operation was scheduled for that night. As much as she worried about her daughter, she was still confused by her conversation with Oscar. He had served his time. Why was he so intent on maintaining his innocence? 5 former students from Oscar's 5th grade class had once given statements against him. Brian and his girlfriend at the time had insisted they'd seen Oscar acting inappropriately. Why would they fabricate any of it? Brian had been crucial in helping Carol remember instances of strange behavior around her, and his promises to reward her were simply for telling the truth, as Jane had believed. She wondered now, had she been so upset by the accusations that she hadn't stopped to question whether Oscar could have been innocent? These were doubts she had fought before, but it was too painful to consider she could have been wrong. Once Jane was sure Carol was doing well after the surgery the next morning, she set out to fulfill her promise to Oscar. telling Brian she was headed to church to pray for their daughter's recovery, a place Brian preferred to avoid. She made her way to the former office of Ben Woods. The receptionist greeted her and repeated what Oscar had been told before. The old file had been archived. Jean insisted, requesting the receptionist retrieve the file herself. The receptionist refused, explaining that only the client could access it and that she didn't have the time to search for it. She added with some curiosity that Jean was not the only one to ask about that particular file. "You must have been the one my ex-husband spoke to on the phone," Jean remarked. "Yes," the receptionist replied. "But I was also talking about the man who came here." "Oscar came here?" Jean asked. "No," the receptionist clarified. "A man who claimed to be Oscar's best friend. He said Oscar had sent him to retrieve it." Jean asked for a description of this man, and her suspicions rose as the description matched her husband, Brian. Doubt started to swell inside her. She was halfway out the door when the promise she'd made to Oscar came back to her. Turning to the receptionist, she insisted, "No, I can't accept that. You are going to retrieve that file right now and give it to me." The determination in her voice unsettled the receptionist. "I can't. It's against the law," the receptionist replied. "Look," Jean said firmly, "a potentially innocent man has suffered unimaginable hardship. I will pay you $1,000 to get that file right now." The receptionist paused, considering. "Make it $2,000, and we have a deal. But you can't tell anyone I did it." In 5 minutes, the office was closed, and Jean and the receptionist headed down to the basement. "I haven't been down here lately. This place gives me the creeps. I only archive files every 6 months," the receptionist said. "Watch out for the cobwebs, and if anything even looks like a mouse, I'm out of here." In the third row of shelves, they turned left and saw files scattered all over the floor. "Oh my gosh, what happened? This box has been emptied," the receptionist exclaimed. It didn't take long to confirm that the emptied box should have held Oscar's file, but the file was missing. Jean felt devastated. Back upstairs, the receptionist apologized. "I'm sorry. I wish I could do something." Jean wept and again moved to leave. "Wait, I almost forgot. After Mr. Vincent's phone call, I checked the records. It showed that Ben had not used up all of the advance money. Maybe Ben put your husband's leftover money in the safe. It could be he put the file there too." The receptionist opened the safe and took out a large clasp envelope with Oscar's name on it. After paying the $2,000, Jean opened the manila envelope. There was a check, a flash drive, and a sworn statement. "I'll let you have everything but the check. Mr. Vincent will have to come and sign for the money. My boss knows about the return check, and I will have to have Mr. Vincent's signature on a receipt. My boss doesn't know about the other stuff." "Sure," Jean said, taking the envelope. Since Oscar was recovering on the same floor as her daughter, she decided to take the file to him. Curiosity, however, got the best of her. While still sitting in her car in front of the PI firm's office, Jean read the sworn affidavit. The date of the affidavit was August 14th, the day before Ben was killed. "Oh my God," Jean thought. "Oscar may be right." She read the statement from Brian's former girlfriend. "This is Betsy MT. I am Brian Hall's former girlfriend, and I helped him frame Oscar Vincent for misconduct. I have not said anything before now because Brian said he would harm me, and I was guilty of perjury. The only reason I am testifying now is that I have stage 4 breast cancer, so I'm no longer scared of Brian or going to prison." Brian managed a department store and would hang out in the toy section. There was a particular doll that girls near Carol's age wanted more than anything else. It was very expensive. When a girl showed interest in the doll, and her mother was not nearby, Brian would ask if they had Mr. Vincent as a teacher. For those who did, it started to work on them. "Wouldn't it be nice to have this doll? It's very expensive, but I give a special discount to brave girls. There is another girl in your class who is very brave. She told me that a man had made her feel very uncomfortable. I agreed with her that no man, other than a doctor, should be allowed to touch her inappropriately. Men like that may not be bad, but they are troubled and need help. The girl usually agreed. Mr. Vincent is a good friend of mine, but he needs help and won't admit it. Has Mr. Vincent ever touched you? The girl would usually say he had touched her hands, shoulder, back, or head. Brian would say, you know that men who touch you in those places are really imagining they are doing something inappropriate. That would usually shock the girl. Brian would continue. That girl I talked about is afraid to say anything unless some other girls tell on Mr. Vincent too. Are you a brave girl? Would you like to see Mr. Vincent get help? I bet your parents have told you to do something that you didn't want to do. They probably said it was because it was the right thing to do, even though you didn't agree. Then you found out afterward that it was indeed the right thing to do. It is the same with adults. Mr. Vincent doesn't believe he needs help, but we need to help him see it's the right thing to do. Will you join your other friends and see that Mr. Vincent gets help? Think of his daughter, Carol. Don't you want to protect her? Here, take the doll home. You can keep it if you and the other girl tell what Mr. Vincent has done. Once he had several girls convinced they had been wronged, he went to work on Carol. Since he was Uncle Brian and had been a guest in their home many times, he had access to Carol. Neither Oscar nor Jane had any fear leaving Brian alone with Carol, especially since he was with me, his girlfriend. He expanded his approach with Carol. Carol, there are a lot of stories in the news about men harming girls your age. Are you scared you might be in a situation like that? She said she was scared of strangers. Did you know that most girls who are harmed by relatives? She said she didn't know that. I don't think any adult male should be allowed to touch a little girl unless he is a doctor. Do you? She said no. Men like that, especially relatives, are troubled and need help. You know your dad and I are best friends. She said yes. Well, he has told me that he has some other thoughts about you. Brian told her. That was his issue. And he asked her if she would help get her dad some assistance for his troubles. She said yes. Jean continued reading the girlfriend's statement. Brian had been keeping a calendar of the times when Oscar, Carol, Brian, and Betsy were together without Jen. Those were days Brian and Betsy testified in court as the days they could say they had witnessed inappropriate actions involving Carol. He rehearsed their testimony for court and came up with answers to the questions Oscar's attorney would most likely ask. Brian gathered the girls and their parents to let them know that his dear friend and their daughter's teacher had harmed their girls. Then Brian asked each girl to share their experiences. He hoped they would gain courage in numbers. It became almost a contest to see who had the most detailed stories. It worked. You could almost see a girl change her story midstream to have the most impactful tale. Brian presented an edited video of the girls to Jen. He told her that he did not want her at the parents' meeting because they might have gotten violent with her. Jean fought the idea that her husband could do such things. When Carol's video came up, she lost it completely. Then Brian told her what he and Betsy had supposedly witnessed between Oscar and Carol while Jane was away. Why would Oscar's best friend lie? Oscar was dead to her at that point, with no desire to hear his side of the story. Jean suddenly realized what a fool she had been and what danger Oscar was in. Brian was probably at the hospital now, ostensibly to visit his stepdaughter, but more likely to harm Oscar. She called the police and asked them to send an officer to the hospital immediately. It took a while to convince them to comply. She left for the hospital as soon as she hung up. Oscar was drowsy, coming out of one of the frequent naps he took after the anesthetic wore off. His stomach muscles cramped every time he coughed. Ouch, that hurts, he thought. He believed he was talking to no one, but then saw the tall figure of a man standing at the foot of his bed. It was Brian. Don't worry, old friend. You won't be hurting much longer. I just wanted you to be sure you knew who was going to finish you off. Why couldn't you have died in prison like you were supposed to? Oscar retorted, Oh well, it did my heart good to hear of all the misery inflicted on you in prison. Maybe it was better for you to have suffered instead of being put out of your misery. After all, You have a pillow in your hand and are starting to approach me. I died a long time ago, Brian. I hope you got everything you wanted. By the way, why exactly did you do it? What did I do that made you so angry that you would force my daughter to lie and my wife to give up on me? What did you do? You took what I wanted most away from me, the woman I wanted to marry. I was dating her before you ever knew her. Then after we had a little fight, you used that time to take her from me. Basically, you took my life from me. Every time I was with you and Jen, I was plotting how to get her back and get rid of you. Finally, I figured out a way. I not only got Jen back, but I also gained a wonderful daughter to boot. Now, to keep everything I've worked for, there's just one more thing I need to do. He was next to Oscar's headrest now. How were you able to get the girls, especially Carol, to tell those lies? Brian described his plot just as his girlfriend had outlined in her statement and confession. He was proud of his accomplishment. Congratulations, Brian. You won, Oscar said flatly. Brian took the pillow and held it tight over Oscar's face. He was surprised that Oscar didn't struggle. Evidently, Oscar was ready to give up. I win again, Brian whispered. It took a while for Oscar to regain consciousness. He took the oxygen mask off his face and saw a lot of people in his room. Medical personnel, law enforcement, and Harvey. Look, he's awake, Harvey exclaimed. Hey, buddy. Sorry it took me so long. I had trouble getting out from behind the bed, but I hurt him. I hurt him really bad. Was that okay? That was fine, Harvey. Do you have the recording? Yeah, but I wasn't sure how to turn it off. Here, you do it. Harvey handed over the device. Oscar turned it off and restarted it to ensure Brian's confession could be heard. Harvey had come to find his friend as soon as he was released. He had hidden in the other half of Oscar's room so he could stay and protect him. Oscar had instructed Harvey to start the recording whenever anyone came into his room while he was asleep. He had just hoped Harvey wouldn't fall asleep too. Did I do good, Carlos? Did I do good? You did excellent, my friend. Excellent. Does that mean good? It means the best good there is. Harvey smiled widely. Oscar handed over the recording to the police after summarizing its contents. They watched as an injured Brian Hall was taken away in handcuffs to the emergency room before being booked. The officer in charge commented, "I've never been handed so much evidence at one time on a case this old." Oscar inquired, "What evidence do you have besides the recording?" "Your wife brought another tape, plus a flash drive and documents for evidence. The DA will love this as far as being able to convict Brian. He won't be happy about having to get your conviction overturned." Oscar's disposition changed sharply. "I don't have a wife. She said she was. Anyway, she's in the room with your daughter." Oscar slipped and showed concern. "How is she?" "Our daughter." One of the medical personnel spoke up. "As far as I know, she's doing fine. No signs of rejection, at least not yet. Do you want to go visit her?" "No, sorry. I didn't mean to upset you. I'm sorry I snapped at you. There's so much history you're not aware of. Thank you for everything." After the police and extra medical personnel left, Oscar turned to Harvey. "Buddy, we need to get back home. As soon as I can walk, we're out of here." He instructed the nurse that no one outside of medical personnel and Harvey was to come into his room, especially not his ex-wife. No exceptions. Then he started the walking and breathing exercises recommended by the hospital staff. That night, Oscar and Harvey heard a commotion outside his room. His ex-wife was demanding to see him. She was told that she was not allowed, and that if she kept up her protest, security would be called. They heard her stomp off. Oscar told Harvey, "We're leaving tomorrow during the early morning shift change." In the middle of the night, Oscar was awakened by a woman who looked like him. It was his daughter. "Daddy, wake up. Wake up, please." As his mind focused, he said grimly, "Well, your mother's record for breaking promises is intact. Go back to bed. I have no daughter. You were going to get me arrested. I'm required to stay 1,000 feet from you. Your conviction will be overturned, and I know you're not a criminal. You do have a daughter, and she loves you very much. She needs to apologize and start making up for being naive. And well, a terrible daughter. You've got to let me back in your life. I can't live with the guilt. Mom showed me the confession from Brian's old girlfriend. I can't believe he got me to lie. Mom and I have been crying for hours. We are so ashamed. You've got to let us make it up to you. Carol was sobbing. There is no way you can make up for what you did to me. I don't have a daughter or a wife, and I certainly don't love you. Get out. He pressed the nurse's button. No, and you do love me. You gave me a kidney. You saved my life. So what? I give away kidneys left and right to anyone who asks for one. You just happen to be one of them. You're welcome. Now go away. Where is that nurse? Daddy, Mom, and I deserve every bit of anger you can throw at us. I will accept it every time you decide to let it out. What I will not accept is not being around you for the rest of your life. I am your daughter, and I am back in your life. I have to go back to bed now, but I'll be back for your daily dose of apologies tomorrow. By the way, Mom says the receptionist at BW's old office has some money for you. She left it for you. Oscar thought, well, that's not quite what I had imagined would happen. He turned to Harvey. What do you want to do, buddy? Harvey, who had heard everything from his bed on the floor, said, no change in plans. We leave tomorrow during the early morning shift change. Oscar had on his regular clothes but had shaved his beard and cut his hair. He acted like he was taking Harvey for a walk, holding on to him to give the opposite impression of who was helping whom. Once outside, Oscar informed Harvey that they did not have to go back to any of the places they had stayed before. He said, we've got some money now, buddy. We can go wherever we want. Where do you want to go? 2 seconds later, Harvey blurted, Disney World. You got it, buddy, Oscar replied with a chuckle. Harvey and Oscar stayed at a hotel near Disney World. They rode every ride Harvey wanted to as many times as he wanted. Both of them couldn't remember a more fun time. But all good times have to end. And so did this one. Where do you want to have a home? I mean a real home, Oscar asked Harvey. You mean you and me? Yes, you and me. I want a house with a garden. I want animals. I want a room of my own. I don't want to live close to anyone else. Harvey, you've thought a lot about this. I'm impressed. Let's go find that house on the edge of town. Oscar found a house to rent that suited Harvey's wishes. They would have to get the landlord to fence in the yard for pets, but by offering an increased deposit, the landlord agreed. Goodwill and a second-hand store provided most of the furniture, but money quickly became an issue. Oscar decided to hire an attorney to sue Brian Hall for several $1 million. The response he got was surprising. Out of the blue, Jean came to his house to see him in person. You don't have to sue Brian, she said. I will be getting everything he has of value in the divorce. You can have whatever you want. I do have a price for my cooperation, Oscar replied coldly. Take it up with my lawyer. I don't deal with unfaithful partners. Damn it, Oscar, I was not unfaithful to you. Brian and I didn't date until we were divorced. You had no faith in me when I was accused of molestation. You had faith in a lying womanizer who only wanted to get into bed with you. He barely worked up a sweat pulling off his scam. You evidently wanted to believe I was a molester. That's how you were unfaithful. Jean hesitated, then admitted, when you put it that way, I can see your point. I will never forgive myself for letting that happen. He was a master manipulator, and I was too easily misled. Did you see how much I cried during the trial? Some tears were for my daughter, but most were for losing my husband, my best friend, the love of my life. I will never stop trying to make it up to you, even if it takes the rest of my life. You don't have enough lifetimes, Oscar said flatly. You may be right. Carol and I talk about what we could do. The way we see it, you have had to build a wall of horrible memories to protect yourself, and we helped build that wall. What we intend to do is use good, new memories to take the bricks out of your wall and use them to build a bridge from us to you. We know it will take a long time. I don't see how you're going to do that when we will not have contact for the rest of our lives. Oh, yes, we will. I have no other job now than to make it up to you and take care of the grandchildren. Did you know that Carol is pregnant? The word grandchildren hit Oscar in the gut. He mellowed suddenly, but recovered. I have no children, so I can't have grandchildren. Oscar, you have endured an unbelievable amount of suffering, none of which was your fault. Why, oh why, would you want to punish yourself by keeping yourself from the joy of watching your grandchildren grow up? While I'm at it, why would you punish yourself by being away from the love of your wife and child when we owe you more love than you've ever had before? Yes, staying away would punish us, and you might get some revenge from that. But that's a dark emotion. It would punish you too. You don't deserve more punishment, even from yourself. Oscar couldn't think of a quick response. Jean let the silence hang in the air for a moment, then said, "Now let's see what two men have done to mess up any sense of decor and how this place is furnished." She proceeded to look through each room and take notes. "What are you doing here?" Harvey asked Jen. "I'm trying to help you and Oscar make this house look better." "Do you mean Carlos?" I get confused with people calling him different names. "That's okay. You can use either name. You don't mind if I help spruce up the place, do you?" "I don't care." "Do you know anything about gardening?" "I can plant and weed and fertilize, but I don't know what I should plant and when." "Can you help?" "I would love to." "And where can I get a puppy?" "Have you been to the animal shelter?" "No." "What is that?" "That's where they keep dogs and cats who are waiting for people to adopt them. I was supposed to be adopted, but no one wanted me." "Well, if you want to go, we'd be glad to take you to the shelter." "Can we go now?" Harvey asked eagerly. Jean chuckled and turned to see a fuming Oscar, who had overheard their conversation. He spoke sharply. "Harvey, we have to get the pen built before we can have pets, remember?" "Jean, can I have a word with you?" Once out of Harvey's hearing, Oscar angrily admonished Jen. "You don't think I know what you're doing, taking advantage of my friendship with Harvey to get your way. If you do anything to hurt Harvey, I will do something to you that will get me back in prison for a crime I did commit." Jean replied sternly, "If there's anyone that's going to get hurt, it's you. If there's anyone who's going to be doing the hurting, that's also you. Now you and Harvey get cleaned up. You two are going to have dinner with me, your daughter, and your son-in-law at 6. Got it?" Oscar paused to think before responding. "I can't think of anything I would rather do, but I almost forgot. I have no car. Sorry, we'll have to take a rain check." "Silly boy. You will take me home in the car I came in. You should recognize it. It's your old car. Carol has been driving it. I gave her Brian's car. She's giving you her car. It's easier to transfer the title between daughter and father. Now take me home." "Dang. I also forgot I don't have a driver's license anymore." "Oscar Vincent, you are not going to get out of this." "I won't tell. Now drive me home." "Oh, I forgot. Harvey, is there anything you don't like to eat?" After thinking for a minute, Harvey offered, "Liver, grapefruit, Brussels sprouts, and butterscotch. I eat most anything else, and lots of it." Oscar drove Jen home. She wasn't silent. "I have carried a lot of hate around for many years. Now that hate has become the hate I have for myself. How could I have been so foolish?" "You probably practiced a lot," Oscar replied dryly. Jane was crying and laughing at the same time. "You are still a smart man, and I love you more now than I ever did. Please let me and Carol love you. You said before that loving me and our grandchildren was all you were going to do. What about your job?" Oscar asked. "I forgot. You haven't kept up with the changes over the years. My mom died recently, and I stand to inherit a nice sum of money. I've already retired. Won't Brian get half of that?" "According to my attorney, he won't. The will hasn't been probated, and the funds have been frozen with my filing for divorce." Jane paused and smiled. Now my next husband will get half. Oscar grimaced at that statement. He drove back to what they were calling the garden home. Harvey was already getting ready to go to dinner. Harvey, I'm not sure we're going. I want to go. That's a nice lady. Why aren't you still married to her? She's pretty too. It's a long story. She and my daughter did some really bad things to me. I don't think I would enjoy being with them. Well, they haven't been bad to me. You have to take me, even if you don't go. Oscar was shocked. This was the first time that Harvey had said he wanted to go somewhere without Carlos or Oscar going with him. This might be a good sign. I'll take you and stay a while. I warn you, I may have to leave early, so you will have to decide to go with me or stay, and have one of them bring you home. I want to stay with them. Oscar thought, damn, they're all ganging up on me. Harvey and Oscar arrived late, and were welcomed with hugs, except for Oscar, who refused. Carol wasn't showing yet but accepted pats to the belly. Oscar turned down that opportunity too, wanting to avoid any misunderstandings. Fortunately, he kept his mouth shut. Everyone was jovial, sharing stories of the old days before the trial. Oscar was dubious of Joe, his son-in-law, who seemed to struggle with shifting from viewing his father-in-law as a demon to an object of pity. Harvey, on the other hand, was having a great time. He had never been part of a family before and seemed to fit right in. Oscar was tempted to let go and become part of the family again, to let bygones be bygones. But then it hit him, and the temptation rapidly disappeared. Jean and Carol had spent the last almost 8 years laughing and loving with Brian while he was in hell. There was nothing that could change that. He excused himself to go to the bathroom, knowing the window could be opened from the inside, and was on the ground floor. Oscar made his escape. His car was in the back on a downhill slope. He put the car in neutral and coasted down the drive. Once on the street, he started the car and headed to the garden home. At the house, he gathered personal items and some cash. He left a note on the door and then headed for parts unknown, even to himself. Jean was the first to notice Oscar's absence. She went to the bathroom. After knocking and calling with no response, she summoned Harvey to break the door open. When he did, she saw the open window and realized he had fled. Jean ran to the front door and saw the car was missing. She drove as fast as she could to the garden home, hoping Oscar had just decided the family scene was too much and needed a break. But when she didn't see his car at the house, she knew her greatest fear was real. The note on the door cemented the issue. Jen, I appreciate that you and Carol want to make up for the tragedy that I suffered. I'm sorry, but when I saw tonight what I had missed out on for over 7 years, I broke down. I forgive you both, but I can't forget. I will never get those 7 years back. Those 7 years of nightmares will never leave me. They are with me every minute of every day. I don't know if I can have a normal life again. If I am able, I believe it must be a totally new life. Please take care of Harvey. He needs a loving family. I do too, but not yours and Carol's. Please don't try to find me. I have to do that for myself. Oscar. Jane started crying again and didn't care if she ever stopped. One moment, she chastised herself for not doing the right thing that would have given her Oscar back in her life. The next moment, she wondered if there was anything that could have made that possible. From that day forward, Jean was the best grandmother she could be. When not being a grandmother, she spent the necessary time ensuring that Harvey and his garden, 3 dogs, and a cat were doing well. All other time was spent figuring out what she should do if Oscar were to give her a second chance. The one activity she agreed to do outside the family was to volunteer at the Salvation Army. Oscar might never come back there again, but maybe she could help others who passed through. She prayed for him to return every night. Oscar agreed with Jane that she and Carol would be punished by their guilt, and he could get some satisfaction that way. He figured 7 years of guilt without any relief from him might be enough, but he doubted it. He wavered back and forth, thinking he had been too nice in the note, all that forgiveness stuff. Anyway, there was more to be had. Oscar did not go too far away because he was waiting to see where Brian would be sent to prison. He prayed it would be the same prison he had been in. Life's pendulum swung back in his favor one last time. Brian was sent to Oscar's former prison. As soon as Brian entered prison, Oscar paid a visit to one of his former tormentors still inside, Tyrone. Word had gotten around for a while that Oscar had actually been found innocent of the accusations. Tyrone spoke before Oscar could. "Hey man, I'm sorry for what we did to you. You know that everyone here says they're innocent. I wish we could make it up to you. Funny you should say that. How would you like to receive a carton of cigarettes every week for the rest of your sentence?" Oscar had heard that the best revenge was a life well lived, and he intended to test that theory. He was on a plane headed for Costa Rica. Why Costa Rica? It was a beautiful country year-round, with a nice climate, relatively safe crime-wise, drinkable water, great food, and cheap utilities. Plus, there were plenty of expatriates if he needed an American fix every now and then. He had read the tour books and selected Grisha, in the middle of the country, as the city to live in, at least for now. Chris Shue from Grisha Real Estate found him a nice house on the bus route. It even had banana, papaya, and mango trees in the yard. He decided against getting a car, at least for the time being, since cars in Costa Rica were very expensive, and the bus and taxi systems were reliable and cheap. He was ready to live life well. Oscar's daily routine started with coffee at Café Delicios near Central Park, by the metallic church. It was a gathering spot for expatriates, mostly Americans, but also Canadians, Europeans, and others. Political leanings varied, left, right, and everything in between. But several patrons avoided political discussions altogether. Many were living in Costa Rica to escape the harshness and divisiveness of political dialogue in their home countries. Oscar had no trouble speaking Spanish with the locals, but he had to adjust to not using as much slang. He also picked up on Costa Rican customs, like saying mucho gusto instead of de nada, and using cheo instead of adios. He was open to forming new connections in this new chapter of his life. Another reason he had chosen Costa Rica was that older forms of companionship were legal and well regulated there. Oscar occasionally visited establishments for companionship, but he didn't keep one woman for long. Some relationships ended when women started talking about needing help for their families or elderly relatives, seeming to have ulterior motives. Others followed after witnessing Oscar's nightmares. When he lashed out during a dream and accidentally struck a companion, he was met with fear. "Why did you hit me? You're crazy," she yelled. "I'm sorry. Please forgive me. I was having a nightmare. You can't hit me. Call a taxi. I'm leaving," she demanded while getting dressed. Oscar made the call, handed her extra money, and was met with a final sting. "You've got a nice body, but you're too crazy for me. You need to see a doctor." Strangely enough, her parting advice stayed with him. He tried sedatives and alcohol in hopes of keeping the nightmares away, but nothing worked. He eventually sought out a local therapist. Medical care in Costa Rica was first-rate and affordable, though none of the expatriates he spoke to had experience with local therapists. His dentist recommended Dr. Rebecca Perez. Dr. Perez was professional, poised, and to Oscar, strikingly beautiful. During their first session, as he described his background and struggles, she noticed how he kept glancing at her. "Is there a problem with the way I am dressed?" she asked directly. "Just the opposite. You're very pretty. I'd love to take you to dinner sometime." She put down her notebook. "You need to decide right now if you want to waste your money and time thinking about an inappropriate relationship with your therapist, or if you want to work to solve your problem. Decide now." Oscar felt ashamed. Hookers and waitresses were about the only women he had interacted with lately. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm here to get help. Please forgive me." "Good," she replied. "Now tell me about your problem." Oscar took a deep breath and began. He described the false accusations, his imprisonment, the betrayal by his wife and daughter, the violence he endured, and his subsequent release. About halfway through, he noticed they were going over the scheduled time. "Keep going," she urged. "I want the whole story." As he described the abuse, the stabbings, the beatings, and the emotional torture, Dr. Perez began to cry silently, even though he had left out the worst parts. When he finished, Oscar was the one crying. He admitted he was afraid the memories would never leave him, and he didn't know how to move on. Dr. Perez acknowledged his pain. "It's unlikely you'll ever completely erase the memories," she said gently. "But what I want you to try is this: every time you have another nightmare, and you will, thank God that it means one less nightmare you'll have to deal with on your way to healing. Be grateful. Learn to see it as progress." Oscar was skeptical of the approach but promised to try. Over the next few weeks, he did as instructed and was surprised by how much quicker he seemed to recover from each nightmare. Gradually, the nightmares became fewer and fewer. When he returned to Dr. Perez, she could see the improvement. "You're doing well," she said. "How are you feeling?" "Better," he admitted. "The nightmares are still there, but not as often. Thank you for that. I haven't had to leave the house at night because of them in weeks, and I actually enjoy sleep now. But there's still anger." Dr. Perez nodded. "You mentioned your family, your wife and daughter, and your difficulty forgiving them. Are you ready to address that?" Oscar hesitated. "I don't know if I can. I mean, I've worked through a lot, but their betrayal, it's different. I can't stop thinking about how they destroyed me." Dr. Perez leaned forward. "What if we looked at it from their perspective?" Oscar's expression darkened. "Their perspective? They turned on me. They abandoned me. I don't see how their perspective changes that." She sighed. "Oscar, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean excusing what they did. It's about freeing yourself. The anger you're holding onto is hurting you more than it's hurting them." Oscar considered this, but said nothing. Dr. Perez shifted tactics. "You mentioned you didn't want to meet your grandson because you don't recognize Carol as your daughter anymore. Can I ask you something? Do you think Jeremy deserves to be punished for something he had no part in?" Oscar stiffened. "I haven't punished him." "Haven't you? You're deliberately staying away from him. That's withholding a relationship he deserves. You're his grandfather, Oscar. Flesh and blood. He did nothing wrong. Are you punishing him because of his mother?" The truth of her words stung. I guess I hadn't thought of it that way. But how can I have a relationship with him without letting Carol and Jane back in?" "Maybe you can't, but you don't know until you try. You need to ask yourself if staying away is worth the cost to you, and to him." The session ended on that note. As Oscar walked home, her words stayed with him. For the first time, he began to consider what reconnecting with his grandson might mean, not just for Jeremy, but for himself. Weeks passed. Oscar maintained his routine in Grisha, but found himself thinking more and more about Jeremy. He told his expatriate friends about the dilemma. One of them, Roger, a Canadian, responded with a wry grin. "Well, friend, I found that never doesn't last as long as it used to." Both men laughed, but later, alone at home, Oscar thought more deeply about it. Maybe it was time to reconsider the walls he had built. One day, Oscar received a letter from his lawyer that included news about Harvey and his life back home. Harvey was doing well. With the money Oscar had arranged, Harvey had been able to buy a house and settle into a stable life. He now worked at the local Southern States Co-op, where he mostly tossed and stacked heavy sacks of feed, grain, and fertilizer. Harvey liked the job, and it suited him perfectly. The lawyer also wrote that Harvey had a girlfriend, Sally. Jean and Carol had apparently vetted her to make sure she wasn't taking advantage of him. Their verdict: Sally truly cared for Harvey. In fact, the lawyer mentioned that it wouldn't be a surprise if the two eventually got married. Oscar smiled as he read this. He had once invited Harvey to Costa Rica, but Harvey had declined because of his fear of flying. Now, with a girlfriend in the picture, Oscar knew there was no way Harvey would leave. Still, Oscar was glad Jean and Carol were keeping their promise to look after Harvey. Thinking good thoughts about Jean and Carol was still unfamiliar to him, so it didn't last long. The news Oscar wanted most was about Brian. His lawyer's letter included an update. Brian had spent most of his time in prison in isolation, with only a few minor altercations reported. That wasn't the kind of justice Oscar had hoped for. He was dissatisfied. Months passed without much change in Grisha. Then, one day, Oscar received another letter from his lawyer. This time, it was about the movie based on Oscar's life. The film was complete, and a premiere date had been set. The producers claimed it would be a major hit. The premiere was to take place in Oscar's hometown. Oscar returned for the premiere, welcomed back by many who had once condemned him. The irony wasn't lost on him. The parties, pictures, and media interviews felt surreal, but he went through with it. Afterward, he visited Harvey to meet Sally. It was a happy reunion, and Sally left a positive impression. She was small and pretty, not even half Harvey's size, but she seemed stable and genuinely in love with him. Harvey couldn't stop grinning as he talked about his job. "I really like my job," Harvey said. "I can get as dirty as I want, and Sally makes me take off my clothes as soon as I get in the door. Then I go to the shower." Harvey grinned, and Sally giggled. Oscar stayed for a while, enjoying the visit. He hadn't felt this good in years. But the good feeling didn't last long. Oscar made his way to the prison to confront Brian. Sitting across the glass from him, Oscar expected a broken man. Instead, Brian sat smirking. "Hey, old buddy, I didn't know what a candy you really were, making such a big deal of your treatment in prison. It's not so bad. A couple of scuffles and some verbal threats. No big deal." Oscar fumed, but Brian continued. "How does it feel to know I was with your ex-wife for 7 years while you were in prison? I probably had more of a connection with her in those years than you two ever did in 15. She just couldn't get enough of me. She said she regretted ever being with you." He laughed cruelly. Oscar's fists clenched as Brian leaned in closer. "Oh, and your daughter. You don't know half the... You lying son of a witch," Oscar shouted, standing up so fast that his chair clattered to the floor. Brian's grin widened. "But you don't know if I'm lying or not, do you?" He burst into laughter again. Oscar left without saying another word, furious. Outside the visiting area, he punched a wall, busting his knuckles. He asked the guards to let him speak to Tyrone, one of his former prison tormentors, who was still incarcerated. After an hour of waiting, Tyrone arrived. "Hey, man, calm down. Don't excite the guards," Tyrone said, noticing Oscar's tense demeanor. "Now tell me what's got you so worked up." Oscar simmered down, though his voice was sharp. "I thought we had a deal, Tyrone. What the hell is going on with Brian? He's walking around like he owns the place." Tyrone smirked. "Oh, I see what you mean. Let's just say Brian's got some friends. Big ones. Word is, his daddy's been making some generous donations to certain groups. That's how he's staying comfortable. But don't worry, Oscar. Things like that don't last forever." Oscar left in a slightly better mood. Tyrone's comment gave him hope that Brian's days of comfort might be numbered. Sure enough, several weeks later, Oscar received a message from his lawyer. It included a cryptic update. The Aryan Brotherhood got a bigger bribe. The only tool Brian will be able to use now is the one he'll find in his mouth, or up his butt. Tyrone's bill has been paid, and I don't want to know what it was for. Oscar finally exhaled. Revenge was bittersweet, but it felt like justice. To celebrate, he bought a round of imperial beers for his expatriate friends in Grisha. "Anyone who says revenge isn't worth it hasn't done it right," Oscar said with a grin. His friends didn't know what he meant, but they cheered and had another beer. Back in Costa Rica, Oscar's desire for revenge against Jean and Carol began to fade. Hearing about Brian's suffering had shifted his focus. The movie, however, had unintended consequences. Though it was a hit nationwide, it portrayed Jean and Carol as horrible villains. Jean was shown as an unfaithful wife. Carol as a rebellious, manipulative daughter, and Brian as a conniving predator. The film's reception devastated Jean and Carol. They became pariahs in their community, shunned and insulted. Carol's son Jeremy was even verbally attacked at press school because of the movie's portrayal of his family. Joe, Carol's husband, couldn't take the stress and left her, fighting for every penny in their divorce. To make matters worse, he spitefully paid child support in pennies and small daily checks. Jean and Carol moved to a different town, living together with Jeremy. Jean reverted to her maiden name, and they faced financial ruin. Jean wrote to Oscar, but the lawyer hesitated to send the letter, knowing Oscar's feelings. Finally, he decided Oscar needed to read it. The letter read, "Dad, Mom and I have spent almost every day feeling guilty about how we treated you years ago. I want you to know we're not feeling so guilty anymore. That's not to say we don't deeply regret what we did, because we do. But the movie has ruined part of our lives that guilt alone hadn't destroyed. We've been shunned, threatened, insulted, and refused service. Jeremy, your grandson, was verbally attacked at press school because of how I was portrayed in the movie. Joe has left me, and he's making my life hell through child support payments. Mom and I are living together now, trying to stay afloat. She's gone back to using her maiden name, and we're facing bankruptcy. I'm sure you're happy about this. At least someone is. We don't go out much anymore, and for fun, we imagine what kind of trouble you have in store for us next. You've won, Dad. I hope you're happy. Screw you. Parole." Oscar's jaw tightened as he read the letter, not because of what Carol said to him, but because others had attacked his family. Revenge was his right, his duty, but outsiders attacking his family felt like a declaration of war. Oscar booked the first available flight back to the U.S. He wasn't sure what he would do, but he knew one thing. No one attacked his family except him. Oscar arrived back in the U.S. and went straight to the town where Jean and Carol had moved. His lawyer had provided their address, and when he arrived, he knocked on the door with trepidation. Jean opened it, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. Jean had aged significantly. Her face was thinner, her hair had more gray than he remembered, and her eyes looked tired and defeated. She turned and called into the house, "Carol, your father is here." When she turned back to Oscar, she could see something unexpected. Tears in his eyes. Her icy expression softened just slightly. "Oh my goodness," she said quietly. "He may have a heart after all." "Well, you might as well come in." As Oscar stepped inside, Jeremy, now a toddler, came running into the room. "Oh, it's my grandfather," the boy exclaimed, clearly repeating something he had heard from the adults. Oscar knelt down and smiled, even as his heart broke a little. "Yes, I am your grandfather. I'm glad to see you again." Jeremy seemed unsure of how to act toward him, looking back at his mother for reassurance. Jean asked bluntly, "Why are you here, Oscar?" He sighed, his voice heavy with frustration and sorrow. "Well, I received a warm letter from Carol that I took as an invitation to visit. So, here I am." Jean crossed her arms. "If you're here to extract any more vengeance from us, just leave now. Actually, we don't expect anything else. So just leave." Oscar raised a hand to stop her. "I wanted to tell you both that I had no idea of the repercussions the movie would have on you. Yes, I intended and enjoyed the revenge I had planned in the past, but you didn't deserve the punishment that has come from others since. It is partially my fault, and I would like to help make up for that." Jean and Carol exchanged a disbelieving look. Carol stepped into the room, her expression a mix of anger and suspicion. "Do you think it's a trick to get our hopes up, just to turn around and crush them again?" she asked Jean. "Could be," Jean replied cautiously. "Let's hear him out. We can always kick him out later." Oscar ignored the sniping and asked, "It appears you've made an effort to start over. How's that going?" Jean spoke for both of them. "Not so good. We're too close to our hometown, and we need to get farther away. But we can't afford it. Carol and I need better paying jobs and someone to help with Jeremy. We didn't want to get too far from Harvey, but he seems to be doing fine with his new wife. Oscar raised an eyebrow, surprised. Harvey got married. Jean nodded. Yes, Sally's her name. He's happy. But we're not here to talk about Harvey, are we? Oscar leaned back slightly. Where would you like to move to? Carol tilted her head in suspicion. As far away as possible. Got any recommendations? As a matter of fact, I do. Oh, really? Jean's voice was dripping with sarcasm. To what do we owe this sudden benevolence from you? I'm really suspicious. You're suddenly treating us with some modicum of decency. I've wanted to see this day for so long, but we're gun-shy. Is this really the day? Oscar hesitated before replying. I guess you could say I've had a sudden attack of responsibility. I've gone to a wonderful therapist who has helped me deal with my nightmares and become something of a human being again. She's helped me see that as much as I owed you retribution, I owed you for the years before that. I think I've had enough revenge, or at least I think I should have had enough. Now, I'm looking forward to that making up time you talked about. Unless that was just talk. Jean's expression softened further. Oscar, you'd better believe it wasn't just talk. If you were around us now, though, you'd think I invented the concept of revenge. Now, what's your proposal? I propose that we get you all away from here. Far away. I can have my lawyer check in on Harvey. We're different people than we were before the trial, and during those 8 years I was gone. I don't know what kind of family we might make again, but I'd like to see if, without the pressure, we can be free to explore possible relationships. I will pay for everything. The movie may have been devastating for you, but it's made me relatively rich. What do you think? Jean and Carol exchanged glances again. Then they both smiled slightly. Carol spoke up. Will we need passports? Oscar smiled faintly. Yes. And here's a book to study. Life with the Vincent family in Costa Rica started well, though not without challenges. Chris from Grisha Real Estate found a home that met Oscar's approval. A 3-bedroom, 2-bath house with a small 1-bedroom guest house on the grounds. Oscar insisted on the guest house for himself, allowing him space to retreat from Jean and Carol when needed. It took a while to furnish the homes and stock the pantry. At first, they ate out a lot, and Jen and Carol discovered how well-known and popular Oscar was in Grisha. For weeks, neither of them would go out without Oscar, partly out of fear of getting lost and partly because their Spanish was limited. They quickly learned, however, that Grisha was easy to navigate, with the metallic church as a central point, and most service workers knew enough English to get by. Oscar enjoyed their initial dependency on him, but he also encouraged them to learn the language and culture. Jeremy was enrolled in a bilingual prep school and fit in almost immediately. Carol was hesitant at first, but seeing Jeremy's excitement after school each day eased her fears. She hired a tutor to improve her Spanish and began offering English lessons to locals. Jean, on the other hand, struggled to adjust. Her daily mood seemed to depend entirely on her interactions with Oscar. She often misinterpreted his neutral statements as criticism, while Oscar tiptoed around her, afraid to say anything that might upset her. One morning, during their usual coffee time on the patio, Oscar decided to address the tension. We need to talk, he began. It feels like we're walking on eggshells around each other. This isn't healthy. What do you think we can do to fix this? Jean sighed, clearly relieved that he brought it up. I've wanted to have this conversation too. You're right. We are walking on eggshells. I think I'm afraid of saying something wrong and setting you off. And maybe I still don't fully understand your pain. But I also feel like you're holding back, like you're waiting for me to fail. Oscar considered her words. You might be right. But I also think we've come a long way, even if it doesn't always feel like it. What do you suggest? Jean hesitated. Would you consider going back to therapy? Together this time. Maybe with someone who can help us figure this out. Oscar nodded slowly. That's not a bad idea. But understand this. I'm not trying to reclaim our marriage. I'm just trying to make our time here as positive as it can be for both of us." "I understand," Jean said. "For what it's worth, I still hope we can rebuild something resembling a family. Thank you for even considering this." Dr. Perez agreed to see both Oscar and Jen. During their sessions, Rebecca noted that while Jen was genuinely remorseful, she didn't fully grasp the depth of Oscar's suffering. One day, she asked Jean the pointed question, "What do you know about Oscar's time in prison?" Jean seemed caught off guard. "Well, he doesn't like to talk about it. I know he was attacked and tortured. I've seen the scars on his chest and his burned hands. I can't imagine how horrible it was." Dr. Perez leaned forward. "Jane, I think part of the problem is that you don't truly understand the level of his pain. You need to hear his story." Oscar groaned. "I don't want to do this. I've moved past it, and I don't need pity." "It's not about pity," Rebecca said. "It's about helping Jane understand the height of the mountain she has to climb to rebuild trust." After a long pause, Oscar agreed. "Fine, but this is the last time I ever talk about it." Oscar began to recount the brutal details of his imprisonment, the betrayals, the physical and emotional abuse, and the hate that had kept him alive. Jean listened in horror, crying silently as he spoke. Several times she had to excuse herself to compose herself in the bathroom. When he finished, both were silent for a long time. Finally, Jean spoke. I had no idea. I thought I did, but I didn't. And now, I don't know how I can ever make up for this." She took a deep breath and continued, her voice breaking. "Oscar, I love you, but I think I need to leave. You deserve a chance to find someone who doesn't remind you of everything you went through. I'll always be here for Jeremy and Carol, but I can't stay." Jean left that day, and while it was bittersweet, Oscar felt a weight lift. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility of peace. After Jen left, life in Costa Rica settled into a new rhythm. Carol and Jeremy stayed, and Carol threw herself into making a new life. She continued her Spanish lessons and became more involved in the local community, teaching English to children and helping at the church's outreach programs. Jeremy thrived in his bilingual preschool, quickly picking up Spanish and making friends. For Oscar, the absence of Jean brought a strange mix of relief and emptiness. He missed the quiet coffee mornings on the patio, but he also appreciated the reduced tension in the house. He continued his daily routine of coffee with the gringos at Café Delicio's, occasional volunteer work, and visits to local restaurants. His relationship with Jeremy grew deeper. The boy's laughter and energy had a way of softening Oscar's hard edges. One morning, as they sat on the patio, Carol said, "Dad, I've been thinking a lot about what Mom did, leaving. I know it must have hurt, but maybe she was right. She thought she was holding you back." Oscar sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "I'm not sure if she was holding me back, or if it was my own anger doing that. Maybe both, but I think she did what she thought was best, and maybe she was right." Carol nodded, her eyes glistening. "I've spent so many years feeling ashamed of what I did to you. I lied because I thought I was protecting Mom and myself. But I've realized I was just a scared kid who didn't know better. That doesn't excuse it, though." Oscar put his coffee down and looked at her. "You were 12, Carol. I've come to understand that Brian manipulated you. I can't say I'll ever forget what happened, but I don't blame you the same way I used to. Jeremy has a lot to do with that." Carol smiled through her tears. "Jeremy loves you so much, and I see the way you've changed since you've been around him. He's brought out the best in you." Oscar chuckled softly. "That kid's got a way of doing that. I never thought I'd laugh again, but he's shown me how." Months turned into years, and life in Gracia became routine. Oscar found himself engaging more with the local community. He even joined a hiking group made up of both locals and expatriates, exploring the stunning landscapes of Costa Rica. Jeremy started primary school, and his teachers often commented on how well-adjusted and bright he was. Carol began dating again, seeing a local lawyer she had met through her church. One day, while having coffee with his gringo friends, Oscar received a letter from Jin. It had been over a year since she had left, and the sight of her handwriting gave him pause. He debated whether to open it, but eventually decided to read it. Dear Oscar, I hope this letter finds you well. Leaving Costa Rica was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made, but I still believe it was the right thing to do. You deserved a chance to heal without me constantly reminding you of the past. I wanted to let you know that I started volunteering with the Salvation Army back in the States. It's not much, but it feels like a small way to atone for the hurt I caused you. I also visit Harvey and Sally regularly. They are so happy together, and I'm proud of how far Harvey has come. I think about you every day, and I still pray for your happiness. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want you to know I'm trying to live in a way that honors the man you were before all of this happened. Please tell Carol and Jeremy I love them, and if you ever decide to let me back into your life, even as a friend, I'll be waiting. Love, Jin. Oscar folded the letter and stared out at the metallic church in the distance. He didn't feel anger, just a quiet sadness. He didn't know if he would ever write back, but a part of him appreciated her words. As time passed, Oscar found himself thinking more about forgiveness. One day, during a conversation with Dr. Perez, she asked, "How do you feel about everything now? About Jen, Carol, even Brian?" Oscar took a deep breath. Jen, she did something I never thought she would. She left because she thought it was best for me. And Carol, well, I see her trying every day. She's a great mom to Jeremy. As for Brian, he paused, his jaw tightening. I think I'll hate him until the day I die. But I don't let it consume me anymore. Rebecca nodded. That's progress, Oscar. You're learning to live with what happened rather than letting it define you. I guess, he said, smiling faintly. I never thought I'd get here. On Jeremy's 8th birthday, Carol threw a party at the house, inviting some of Jeremy's classmates and their parents. Watching the children play in the yard, Oscar felt a rare sense of peace. Carol approached him, holding a plate of cake. Dad, I've been meaning to ask, are you happy here? I know things have been complicated, but I hope you found some kind of peace. Oscar looked at her and smiled. I think I have. For the first time in a long time, I feel content, maybe even hopeful. Carol's eyes softened. That's all I've ever wanted for you. Jeremy ran up then, his face smeared with frosting. Grandpa, are you coming to play soccer with us? Oscar laughed. You bet I am. Let me finish my cake first. As Jeremy ran back to his friends, Carol leaned over and kissed Oscar on the cheek. Thank you for giving us another chance. Oscar watched his grandson playing, surrounded by laughter and joy. For the first time in years, he felt like his life was his own again. There were still scars, both physical and emotional, but they no longer defined him. He was finally learning to live. One evening, as the sun set over the hills of Grisha, Oscar sat on the patio with a cup of coffee, listening to the sounds of the town below. Carol joined him, carrying a book. They sat in companionable silence, the air warm and fragrant with the scent of blooming flowers. For the first time, Oscar didn't feel the weight of the past pressing down on him. Instead, he felt the quiet promise of tomorrow. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.